Well, welcome once again to another reading of The Oath by Frank Peretti. We are going to be reading chapter 10 today. Now, we had just got through where Dr. Benson and Deputy Tracy Ellis had a little shootout with something that they really had no clue what it was, and it was really freaky. So, once again, um, there is advisory. There could be violence, uh, but on the whole part, just go on ahead and get into it with me, and let's see what happens next. Chapter 10 of The Oath. Sam wasn't all that big or tough, but the guys in the platoon were still afraid of him. He could stare down anybody, and there was something spooky about him, like maybe he could sick some demons on you if he wanted. We got along okay, 'cause anytime Sam felt like bragging, I'd just listen. From a memorial written by Dennis Mason, an old Army buddy of Samuel Harrison Bligh, sent to the Bligh family after Sam, 53, disappeared in 1981. If you notice, these little leaflets all have a different date on them. Some going way back behind 1900s. Turning off the ringer. That way, if anybody calls, there's no interruption. Chapter 10. Perfect. They were cursing the darkness, longing for daylight, for steady hands, cramming ammunition into the rifles and shotgun in the quivering beams of their flashlights, their bodies trembling with stark terror and adrenaline. Two more, Tracy said, and Steve dug the cartridges out of the box and slapped them into her hand. She jammed the first into the magazine, the second flipped out of her shaking fingers and disappeared into the tall grass. Steve shined his light on the ground while she groped for the fallen cartridge. He was looking toward the river and the mountain slope just beyond it, pained by the passing of each precious second. That thing was still alive out there and getting away. If it managed to hide itself somewhere, perhaps crawl into a cave and die, they might never find it at all. Tracy found the cartridge and slammed it in. She got to her feet and slung the rifle over her shoulder. "Let's go, Steve," said Steve. They headed for the river, stumbling in the dark, thrashing through the brush. "What was it? Did you see it?" Tracy gasped as they ran. "I saw a lot of sparks, and that was about it," Steve said. "Where'd it go?" "Upstream. Watch your step." They reached the embankment just above the rolling current, then moved upstream. The riverbed widened, and they stepped onto a shore of dry river rocks. "Okay, here we go," Steve said quickly, his light sweeping over the expansive riverbed ahead of them. The rocks, normally above the river's level and sunbaked this time of year, were wet, as if a wave had just washed over them. "That first big splash we heard," said Steve. "There was another one further upstream." They ran, chasing the circles of light from their flashlights over river rocks, clumps of grass, boulders, and high water debris. Then Steve noticed that the bushes around them were dripping, the rocks darkened and glistening. This was the second point of impact. They stopped and searched every direction with their lights. The river slid quietly but quickly over the rocks. Here and there, water rippled and splashed around a boulder. They waited. They listened. A limb snapped somewhere across the river. There was a thrashing in the brush. They shined their lights on the river, probing its depths. The river ran wide and shallow here, maybe shallow enough to ford, Steve thought. He slung his rifle and shotgun over his shoulders and went in first, wading several yards into the moving water until it was up to his knees. He raved with his light, and Tracy followed. Inch by inch, they waded through the painfully cold water. The moment either of them lifted a foot off the slippery rocks, the water carried it sideways. They slipped, stumbled, and helped each other regain their balance. Finally, they made it to the middle of the river where the water rose well over their knees. They pressed on. The water began to drop away. She felt a surge of hope, then relief. They were going to make it. Finally, they splashed through the water only ankle deep and made it to the opposite shore, their legs numb with cold, their hearts racing. They hurried through tall river grass, away from the sound of the river, then stopped to listen. They felt vulnerable, exposed. Whatever they were after, there was no longer a river between them, only darkness, which had to be to the creature's advantage, not theirs. They heard it again, moving slowly through thickets and dry twigs far up the mountain. Steve looked at his watch. 2:15, he whispered. 2 more hours and we'll start getting some light. Silence. They listened. Nothing. But what is it? Tracy asked. We don't even know what we're chasing. We know its approximate position, Steve replied. If we can keep tabs on it until daylight, we might get a look at it. Tracy's light swept across Steve's face. Did you know you're bleeding? Where? Tracy brushed the hair from his brow to expose a wound. He rinsed a little, touched it, saw blood on his fingers. How bad is it? Not too bad. You banged your head on something, or something banged you. It didn't hurt until now. He pulled out a bandana and tied it around his head. That would do it. No lights unless absolutely necessary. Let's go. They started up the slope, sometimes on all fours, pushing through thickets and deadwood, grabbing at bushes and limbs, groping for footholds. It was impossible to be silent. They had to pause frequently to listen. Sometimes they could hear a sound above them, sometimes not. They pushed up the steep grade through thick, low growth for several hundred feet and finally broke through to a more gradual, grassy slope peppered with outcroppings of rock. They were in the open again. They crouched low and listened. Above them, there was a slow dragging sound. Dry leaves, twigs, and gravel grated against the rocks. Some pebbles tinkled and pattered down the mountainside. The sound was closer now. They were closing the distance. Steve paused. We'd better pace this a bit. I don't want to catch up with it, not in the dark. This is crazy, Tracy whispered. We don't even know what that thing is. And what if you're right? What if that thing killed your brother and Maggie and Vic? I'm sure it did, and I want it. Tracy could only repeat with genuine fear in her voice, this is crazy. He touched her shoulder gently. She took it as comfort. Then he pushed her a bit. Let's spread out. Stay about 50 yards over that way. We'll whistle to locate each other. She wasn't happy about it, but she moved away from him, carefully making her way across the rocky meadow while he began working his way toward a tree line above him. They advanced up the mountain, pushing into thick pine and fir forest, taking it slow, closed in by branches, foliage, and blackness. Slowly, slowly. There were no trails here, no easy hiking. Sometimes they could hear movement higher up the mountain. Mostly they only heard each other. Steve halted. He had been pushing branches out of the way, snapping some of them off. Suddenly he felt no branches. They seemed to have been broken off already. He clicked on his flashlight for a better look. The space ahead of him was clear. Yes, the branches were freshly broken. At last, he had actually found the creature's trail. He whistled to Tracy, then softly called her, and she rejoined him. They followed the trail of matted down grass, broken limbs, overturned stones, fresh clawed dirt. Measured against the trail usually left by big game, this creature was leaving a superhighway. They climbed, and they climbed some more, and always the unseen creature stayed just ahead of them, as if matching them step for step. It would push through branches and kick over rocks, and they would follow the sound. It would fall silent, and they would wait. Then it would move again, and they would follow again, and on it went. Friday night had become Saturday morning, and the darkness was showing a hint of gray when Charlie Mack finally fell asleep. Pardon. His body thrown fitfully across his bed, now stripped of sheets and blankets by the night's ravings and terrors. Phil Garrett had long since passed out on the floor, his fears momentarily forgotten somewhere in his liquor-scrambled brain. The pain over his heart quelled by the booze, at least for now. Harold Blythe slept rather well through the night, except for one brief moment when he was awakened by what sounded like distant gunfire. He gave it a good listen, some careful thought, and then smiled to himself and lay his head down again, unruffled. The rest of his night was uneventful. 4 o'clock rolled around, and the stars began to fade behind a sky of dark blue velvet. Across the valley, the ridge line of the far mountains was emerging from the night, sharp and distinct. It would be a clear, crisp morning. With the light of dawn, Steve quickly made a new discovery. Blood on the ground, some more on a low limb. It's wounded, all right. They quickened their pace, still following the trail, now seeing spots of fresh blood every few yards. The forest gave way to acres of broken, tumbled rocks, a vast rock slide. They followed the blood trail across it, the rocks teetering and tilting under their feet, their ankles stressed and aching. Then came more forest, mostly thin, ravaged pines, the roots groping for any available crack in the rocky ground. They were close to the ridge line, the jagged, rocky spine of the mountain. The air was cold and thin, and now, especially after a night of hard climbing and no sleep, both Tracy and Steve could feel the altitude. Tracy sank to an uninviting rock to rest a moment. Steve, after some consideration, joined her. She was breathing hard now, but so was he, and he had a pounding headache. Oxygen depth, he muttered. Hypoxia. Try exhaustion, she complained. That thing's wearing us out, and we aren't even wounded. I'm cold, I'm still wet, and my feet are killing me. Steve couldn't blame her for griping. He was pretty miserable himself, but he wasn't about to give up. Have you noticed this creature's behavior? He asked. He looked ahead and could still see some drops of blood for them to follow. What do you mean? Tracy asked, rinsing as she rubbed one of her sore ankles. He keeps giving himself away, unlike any other animal. If he just would have hidden quietly, we would have lost him. But every time we stop to listen, he makes more noise. He paused to breathe, to survey the vast mountain stretching below them. From one perspective, you could say we're chasing him and making him retreat. From another perspective, you'd think he was leading us, almost daring us to follow him. It's strange. Strange is right, Tracy agreed. When do you think he's going to run out of blood? I don't know, but that has to be a factor by now. He can't go on forever. Neither can we. Steve rose to his feet. So come on, let's end this. Tell him that. Steve started out again, following the drops of blood, and Tracy stayed with him, listening intently and warily, eyeing the ridge above. The trail followed just below the ridge for another mile and then disappeared around a towering formation of rock. A blind corner. They stopped. Great spot for an ambush, Steve whispered. Steve brought the 30-06 down from his shoulder, and Tracy did the same. They each chambered a round. Then, next craning, backs close to the rock, they inched their way around the corner, watching ahead, above, behind. On the other side, the blood trail led upward over fallen, broken rocks and into a towering gap in a sheer rock cliff. They looked at each other. I think he's come home, Steve whispered. You take that side. They separated again, Steve on the right, Tracy on the left, and carefully approached the opening, rifles ready. The breach in the cliff was about 10 feet wide and appeared to be the entrance to a larger cavity in the rock, a vast room open to the sky. They couldn't see how far back it went, but the walls reached at least 60 feet above their heads. They hurried to positions tight against the rock walls on either side of the entrance, rifles ready. It reminded Tracy of a police bust. What now? Steve motioned for Tracy to remain where she was, then stole carefully into the breach, his rifle level at his waist, the barrel aimed ahead. He advanced a few paces, stopped to look and listen, then advanced a few more. Tracy leaned into the entrance, craning her neck to keep an eye on him, her rifle barrel aimed skyward. Elk fever was setting in, and she didn't trust her trigger finger. The narrow passage took a slight turn, and Steve disappeared around a corner, out of sight. Not good, she thought. A moment passed. Steve? She called quietly. Talk to me, Steve. There was silence, and then he let out a tired, oh. Tracy thought he sounded disappointed. Steve? Come on in, he answered. Take a look. She slipped hurriedly through the opening, ran up over a mound of rubble, then turned the corner to find Steve standing just inside, his rifle at rest in his hand. On the floor at his feet there lay a large mound of brown fur, a grizzly. It was dead. Tracy rested against the stone wall and sighed, feeling deflated. It was only a grizzly? Only a huge bear? She knew she was supposed to be relieved, be glad it was all over, be glad they'd succeeded in the kill, but all this for a grizzly? She engaged the safety on her rifle and let the rifle rest at her side. You were right, she said at last. It was a grizzly. Steve set down his rifle and shotgun. His disappointment was evident, as was his perplexity as he circled the bear, examining it. He checked the front claws, spread the jaws open to check the teeth, tried to estimate the length and shoulder height. He ran his fingers over the neck, the back, the belly, looking for wounds. Fairly young boar, he reported, and then found a small metal tag on the ear. Number 201. Marcus Dufresne would know all about him. I don't understand this, she said, as events of the previous night started coming back to her. How could this bear, were we imagining things? Steve withdrew his hand from the bear's neck. Blood covered his fingers. He found the wound. Gotcha, came a third voice. Tracy jumped. Steve grabbed his rifle. They both swung around, and then recognition, relief. They saw a familiar face in the narrow entrance, a beard, wire-rimmed glasses, a cowboy hat. Levi Cobb. Tracy did not appreciate being scared like that, much less seeing this man in this place at this time. What are you doing here? Levi remained in the entrance, one hand leaning against the towering wall. He looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible through the rift, then surveyed the tight pocket in which they all stood. Saving your lives, I expect. Steve was angry. By endangering your own? Don't you realize we were on a hunt, that our nerves were on edge? We could have shot you. Levi was unruffled. Oh, it was a hunt, all right. If I was the dragon, you'd be breakfast. Tracy only sighed and shook her bowed head. Here we go again. Go ahead, said Levi. Look around. Just say I'm the dragon. How would you get out of here? Tracy turned to walk away. I am not in the mood for one of your lectures, Levi. In this tight space, she couldn't walk far, but just to make a statement, she walked as far as she could. Steve didn't know what to think. True to form, Levi was mixing his weird superstitions and folksy ways with practical truths, which made it hard to dismiss him out of hand. Call him a fanatic or a nut, be enraged at his theatrics, but he was right about this cavity in the rocks. There was no way out. If there was a dragon and Levi was it, then Steve couldn't help being a bit embarrassed. Levi insisted. Go on, Professor. Take a good look at that bear. He wasn't shot, not a mark on him except for the throat. Am I right? Steve had already discovered the throat was slit. How did you know that? A guess, mostly. If I was the dragon and wanted a quick source of blood, that's what I'd do. Excuse me. Levi, we've been chasing this bear all night, and I'm a little tired. Please, just make your point. You weren't chasing the bear, Professor. The dragon caught that bear and cut it to leave a blood trail for you to follow, and you did. Tracy was insulted. Do you honestly expect us to believe that? You probably killed this bear. Yeah, with my bare hands, Levi said, and I cut that whole trail through the woods too, broke off all the limbs, dug up the ground, led you along. He looked at the dead bear. And lugged that carcass all the way up the mountain on my back just to fool you, just to have a good time. All right, said Steve. Levi, just get to the point. He gave a snort of disgust. Levi looked straight and level into Steve's eyes. If you don't buy what I have to say, well, I'm used to it. But I'll have you know, Professor, the dragon can fly. He don't have to smash and claw his way through the woods, leaving a trail the size of a freeway, unless he wanted you to follow him. He looked around the cavity in the rocks one more time, then locked eyes with Steve again. He was hunting you, Benson. Take a look. Haven't you used this method yourself? Set out some bait, find a good blind, a good vantage point, wait for the game to come after the bait, and when he does, you take him. He motioned toward the bear. You were so intent on that old bear, you didn't even hear me coming. Steve looked down at the bear. Levi was right. The grizzly had drawn his full attention. He had dropped his guard. Tracy stormed toward the entrance. I want no part of this. He would have trapped you. Can't you see that? Levi asked. She only pushed her way past him and got out of there. For a long moment, Levi and Steve just gazed at each other, Levi hoping to convince, Steve reluctant to believe. Maybe you should explain something first, Steve said. I'd like to know how you got here and how you found us. Followed you. That was easy enough. How did you even know what we were doing? God told me. And besides that, I could hear you shooting up O Town. Wasn't hard to figure out. So you just sneaked behind us all that time? Why? Levi looked the direction Tracy had gone. What I say don't carry a lot of weight around here. I had to let you walk into it so I could make my point. Tracy's voice echoed through the narrow entrance. Steve, don't even listen to him. He's totally out of touch with reality. Was he? That was one thing about Levi. You could never be sure one way or the other. But Levi responded to Tracy's remark by beckoning to Steve. Come on, Professor. If you must see to believe, come on. They ran out through the rift. Tracy was back down the mountain a short distance, sitting on a rock looking out over the valley waiting. When she heard them come out over the rocks, she looked in their direction long enough to shout, "Steve, don't waste your time. Let's go." "Your choice, Professor," Levi said. Steve sighed. "All right, 5 minutes, Levi, and that's all." "Fair enough. Just follow me." Steve followed Levi several yards along the rock face until they came to an outcropping. Steve followed Levi up the steep formation, finding plenty of foot and hand holds on the way. Before long, they stood above the deep rail in the rocks and could see the bear's carcass on the narrow floor far below. "I guess you could call this a bear stand," Levi said. "That old lizard was up here watching you, just waiting for his chance." There was every reason to doubt what Levi was saying, and yet as Steve looked down into that rocky pit with one narrow entrance, he had to admit it made an ideal trap. "How do you know he was up here?" "Made a little side trip up here on a hunch. Come see what I found." Steve followed him to a flat area about 15 feet back from the edge. "Soil's a bit scarce up here," Levi said, "but that old snake put his foot in some of it. Don't know if he meant to, but here it is." Levi pointed to a patch of dry, sandy soil. "See here? These are the toes. There's 3 of them, see? And up here, see? Here's where the tips of the claws poked in." Steve thought that the scratch marks and indentations in the soil were difficult to interpret, but someone with a vivid imagination might see them as an immense footprint about 30 inches from heel to tip of toe. Steve played along, figuring he could sort fact from fiction later. "And I suppose this down here is some kind of opposing thumb?" "Yeah, he has those on all 4 feet." Steve was almost amused. "You seem to know a lot about this creature. Write down how many toes it has." "I've tracked it before." "And how do I know you didn't create this footprint yourself?" "How do you know you were just shooting at a bear?" Steve had no answer. He could not deny that the dead bear hadn't died from one of his or Tracy's bullets, and Levi seemed to know that. The big mechanic was getting the upper hand in this discussion, Steve thought. Actually, he may have had it since the word gotcha. Okay, so he would listen, Steve told himself, and sort it all out later. "So where did it go?" "Well," Levi looked a little sheepish, "it flew off." "Why would it fly off when it had 2 perfectly good meals walking into its trap?" Levi scuffed the ground with the toe of one boot before answering quietly. "It just doesn't like being around me." "Oh, of course, Levi, of course. Anything else?" Levi seemed to know he hadn't made a sale. "I've taken your 5 minutes. I guess that'll have to do." Tracy called from below. "Steve, come on." Steve started back down. "Thanks for the input," he said over his shoulder. "She's married," Levi said. Steve stopped. Now that bit of information he had not asked for. He gave Levi a glaring look to shut him up. The big bearded man just gazed back at Steve, his eyes steady. Well, now Steve could see why Levi Cobb had so many enemies. It seemed to be his peculiar gift. "Steve," came Tracy's voice, "are you through up there?" "Quite through," he hollered back and headed down over the rocks. "So," Tracy thought out loud as they hiked down a mountain trail, they were heading back by an easier route, a poplar hiking trail that followed the ridge and connected some alpine lakes known for their hungry trout populations. Levi saw us tracking the bear and thought he'd make a big dragon story out of it. It's that simple. Tracy, you do recall what we went through in Old Town, don't you? You emptied your rifle at something. I got this bump on my head, and we were both scared senseless. It was a windstorm, that's all. The wind knocked over parts of Hyde Hall, and in the dark we made it out to be more than it was. Is that why we were both firing into the air? If I'm not mistaken, there was something up there. It could even have been flying. It was just the wind knocking Hyde Hall around. I shot in the direction of the sound. What about the splashes in the river? The bear running from the noise. We hit it and it was trying to get away from us. Steve realized that he hadn't told Tracy how the bear had died. Tracy, we didn't kill the bear. He, we didn't even hit it once. What are you talking about? She asked crossly. We followed a trail of blood, didn't we? Yes, Steve agreed. We did. But that bear wasn't hit with a bullet. Someone managed to cut its throat. A 500-pound bear. Tracy was determined to put the event into a rational context. Well, right now, the bear came back to Old Town, and that's when the windstorm blew up. Then, when the boards fell from Hyde Hall, maybe one of them hit the bear, cutting its throat open. And it ran and splashed across the river, and that's what we heard. Of course, we were going nuts, shooting at fallen boards, treetops, who knows what else. In the dark, we could have been shooting at anything. Tracy, don't you think that's pretty far-fetched? Steve, come on, it's the only scenario that fits. Steve came to another halt and faced her. The only scenario that really fits is Levi's. Levi. It was like a magic word that could change a beautiful woman to stone. Steve, no, I can't accept that. He was amazed. What is it about that guy that eats at you so much? It was a tough question for her to answer. He's a fanatic. He's a he's a nosy, mouthy, always poking around religious fanatic. Well, he certainly holds a powerful grip on you. I beg your pardon. The way you let him affect you. All he has to do is enter the situation and suddenly, poof, your objectivity is gone and you're concocting untenable theories. I'm concocting untenable theories. Yes, just to keep him from being right. Now she was angry. That is not true. I simply do not regard Levi Cobb as a reliable source of any information. Are you still married? Bullseye. Her mouth dropped open with horror and indignation. Did he tell you that? Yeah. She put her hands on her hips and said angrily, how dare he tell you that? Steve was content to stand right there in her path and get this settled. Are you? She was too concerned with what Levi had done to hear Steve's question. You see what I mean? My private life is none of his business. So he's lying. It's none of his business. He's not lying. He's invading my privacy. That's what he's doing. Well, are you married or aren't you? No. Then, well, she was silent for a moment, then said, I'm married on paper. Then she quickly added, but I'm not married in my heart, and I think there's a big difference. His expression was puzzled. You're married, but not really. She thought that over and then nodded. He stood there on the narrow trail, just musing over this new development, then finally answered, well, I'm divorced. Really? And when you asked me, I didn't equivocate. That hit a bullseye of another kind. She looked ashamed. Steve, I'm sorry. I should have been upfront about it. So who's the lucky guy? Doug. Doug Ellis. You met him in the tavern. Steve's eyes widened in surprise. You married Doug? She cocked her head to one side, her eyes saying, need I say more? Steve replayed the memory of the tavern scuffle and the big roughneck looking for trouble. I would say we more than met. Why in the world did you marry him, if I may ask? It was a mistake, okay? He made a lot of promises, and I was in love, and I believed him. He was going to go into computers, and we were going to move away from here. Steve tried not to look incredulous, but it wasn't easy. Doug in computers? Well, if he didn't have such a thick head, he could have done it. Besides that, he likes the valley, and all his buddies are here. And his buddies come before me, so what can I say? All the dreams died. So how long have you not really been married to him? We've been separated about 2 months. Steve slowly turned down the trail again. I see. Well, he thought, that can't be all bad news, now can it? Steve, he stopped and looked back. I'm tired. I know a cabin near here. What do you say we take a break, have some breakfast or something? Or something? He scolded himself. All right, Steve, now cut it out, he finally said. I guess I'd be agreeable to that. Homer Reston's log cabin on Lake Pauline was a welcome sight. Homer, a retired timber worker and longtime friend of Tracy's parents, had built the place as a vacation getaway 40 years ago and shared it with Tracy's family for many a lazy summer. Homer and his wife were back east visiting relatives, but Tracy knew where the key was kept and was sure Homer wouldn't mind their using it. Lake Pauline was one of those small and serene alpine pools hidden in a forested hollow, a placid home for trout and crappie, a mirror to perfectly reflect the grandeur of the mountain peaks that towered above it. As they descended the winding trail toward the cabin, Steve could sense the quiet of this place enfolding his soul like a comforting hand, and for the first time anywhere in this valley he felt welcome. Tracy began to relax as well, as if each step she took was a step back in time. You wouldn't believe the trout in this lake, she said. My folks and my sister and I would catch our limit every time we came up here. Too bad we didn't bring fishing rods. I'm sure there are some at the cabin, but I don't think we'll have time. She smiled wistfully. It sure would be nice, though. The trail came to a flight of stairs made from flat stones. They descended the stairs quickly, the green metal roof of the cabin and the jewel blue lake visible through the trees. I'm ready for this, said Tracy. A good rest, something to eat? I hear you, said Steve. Genuinely tired and wanting nothing more than a soft bed and a long nap. From here, it's about a 2 hour walk back to Hyde River, so I suppose we could get back to where you parked your camper in less time than that. We could stick around here until this afternoon if we want. They made it to the bottom of the stairs and onto a veranda of crude planks that wrapped around the cabin from the back to the front. Tracy found the key in its same old hiding place atop a rafter just over the front door. She opened the squeaky screen door, unlocked the old paneled door, and they were in. Wow, she said, making several turns to take it all in. It hasn't changed a bit. Steve looked around and smiled. My kind of place, no question. The cabin consisted of one big room separated by the furnishings into the kitchen, dining, and sleeping areas. The rough hewn table and chairs, the old wood burning cook stove, and the two double bunks were all holdovers from an earlier time. The cabin had a particular smell that reminded Steve of family vacations, summer camp roughing it, and childhood in the woods. At either end of the cabin were sleeping lofts accessible only by ladders, the kind of thing every kid loved to turn into a fort, a hideout, an adventure. Tracy sat at the table and delicately removed her shoes and socks, moaning with relief. Steve did the same. Then they opened their backpacks and pulled out the food provisions they'd brought. Some instant soup, a few sandwiches, some instant coffee. The sandwiches would do for now. Neither had the patience or energy to build a fire for hot water. Tracy munched on a tuna sandwich, downed a long drink of water from her canteen, and then asked, Steve, what are we going to do next? Steve had a large bite of his salami sandwich in his mouth. He swallowed quickly so he could answer. You tell me, you're the one who knows Hyde River. That's what has me over a barrel right now. I'm supposed to be the cop protecting Hyde Valley from the likes of you, and now I've helped you shoot up Old Town and meddle with Hyde River's best kept secret. Steve raised his eyebrows. What happened to the rainstorm you were trying to sell me? She had to admit it. It was more than that. More than a bear? She hesitated, then managed to say, Yeah, a lot more. Steve kept one eyebrow up and narrowed the other eye. Careful now, you might be affirming Levi's claims. She laughed. Oh, hardly. It's still up to me to determine exactly what it was I saw last night. Saying that freed her to say the rest of it, but it still wasn't easy. Steve, a thing like this takes time to sink in, you know? As long as I've lived here, it was nothing but superstition and folk tales. It wasn't real. Now, well, we ran into something last night that scared the daylights out of me. Steve nodded. And it scared Evelyn, too. Scared her out of her mind. Tracy rested her forehand on her fingers. Her condition makes sense now, doesn't it? She looked up. But why should anyone believe it, Steve? I mean, consider how long this tradition has gone on and how long that thing's managed to hide in these mountains. How could it go undetected for so long? You've got hunters, anglers, campers, hikers, fish and game, the Forest Service, and nobody's seen anything? What's the trick here? Steve rested his chin on his knuckles and thought that one over. This may sound far-fetched, but perhaps the creature used to be smaller so it could hide more easily. If it's still growing, if it's as big now as it appeared to be last night, then I don't think it can hide much longer. It's going to be detected. It has to be. Now it was her turn to raise an eyebrow at him. I would say that's already happened. He laughed. Oh, yeah, it sure has. But I wish I knew what the creature is and what its habits are. It's going to be tricky finding out. Don't forget, we're still up against a whole town that's trying to hide that thing and protect it. They worship that thing. They made a religion out of it. With Harold Bly at the center of that religion. Am I right? Tracy nodded and taking full advantage. I could see now it's more than just talk. Then she added grimly, and Doug's involved somehow, I know it. There were things he just wouldn't discuss with me, and I always had a hunch about it. So, Steve ventured, I guess it's safe to say my brother wasn't killed by Harold Bly. Not directly, anyway. When he looked at her strangely, she tried to qualify herself. Well, maybe he has that creature trained. You never know. That's just too weird to think about. Tracy reminded him. I don't think Harold was above killing Maggie, though. That was still in his interest, however it happened. Steve took another bite of his sandwich. Finally, he said, We might take another look at the legends and traditions. In all the fiction, we might find some clues as to the facts. You're not talking about a lot of fiction, Steve. Well, how about Levi? What can we glean from his version? Steve did want to know, but he also figured he'd test her reaction again. She reacted calmly, but she was still resolute. There are other sources we could turn to. She took another bite of her sandwich, considered while she chewed, and then revealed. I have a new informant in Hyde River who calls me every once in a while. I think things are heating up. People are getting nervous, so he's daring to break the oath and leak information. He's scared, so he's talking. I'm thinking if he's scared, maybe somebody else is too. Steve cocked his head to one side and asked, He wouldn't be a Frenchman by any chance? She stared at him. He's called you too? Twice now. He was the first one to tell me about Old Town, and he tipped me off that Vic Moore was heading for Hyde Hall. And you know the rest of that story. Why didn't you tell me? You weren't exactly in my camp at the time. He was pleased to see that she looked a little sheepish. Anyway, do you know who he is? No, but we're going to find out. We have to be careful, though. The folks of Hyde Valley aren't going to appreciate us getting this close to their whatever it is. Steve allowed himself a slight sneer. Well, that's too bad, isn't it? Steve, it makes no sense to me that anyone would want to hide and protect something that's killing people. Steve, this is Hyde Valley. Things don't have to make sense. She could see he was bothered. What? Why in the world do you stay here? She didn't mind the question. Actually, she welcomed it. I'm running out of good reasons. My father passed away 2 years ago, and my mom moved to Idaho to live with my aunt. I've told you what it's like trying to be a cop around here, and as far as love is concerned, you know how that's going. I'm married, but not really. No, not really. She looked up at the rough hewn center post that held up the ceiling. Just look at that. He followed her gaze and saw names carved in the wood. He rose and went closer. Agnes, Jerry, Cindy, he read. My mom and dad and my little sister. And Tracy. I carved that when I was 12 years old. She searched his eyes as she asked, Remember being 12? He did. Go-karts, skateboards, swimming in the lake, building a fort in the woods, and definitely camping out with his mom, dad, and Cliff. He smiled and nodded. Did you enjoy it? I did. Back then, everything was, oh, the way it should be. Seems like that was the last time it was ever that way. Feeling weary, Steve ran over to a bunk. You've got time, Tracy. Don't waste it. That's all I could say. She smiled at him. You're right. Talk to you later, he said, flopping down to get some sleep. Have a good nap, she replied, taking the bunk across the room. He was asleep within moments, and she lay on her side, gazing at him, as she had wanted to do since she first met him. Now she took all the time she wanted to study his strong, square chin, his ruddy complexion, his jet black hair with just the right touch of gray. She heaved a deep sigh. Wish you'd been around a lot sooner, Steve Benson. Finally, she too fell asleep, her eyelids closing on his image. Steve woke up slowly, savoring that sweet state between dreaming and reality. A breeze carried the scent of pine into the cabin, and Steve could hear the clear song of the birds, feel the warmth of a summer day. They reminded him of every great vacation of his life. He was a kid again, with no trouble, no pain, no worries. But slowly, steadily, the real world returned, nudging him when he didn't want to be nudged. He sat up, regrouping and thinking about his situation. The angle of the sun had changed. It must be almost noon, he thought. He looked at his watch. Yep, that meant he slept about 2 hours. He felt he could sleep the rest of the day, but necessity got him to his feet. They had to get back to Hyde River, back to business. Tracy's backpack was still leaning against the center post that bore her carved name, but she wasn't in the cabin. He ran out the front door, across the veranda, and down the short trail to the lake's edge. He expected he would find her down there, and it gave him a good excuse to see the lake. He couldn't be in a place this beautiful without taking a moment to enjoy it. Old Homer had worked hard getting a beach established, Steve thought. The coarse sand under his feet was not typical for a mountain lake. It had to have been put there, probably over many breathtaking days. More labor had gone into a rough-hewn dock that reached out into the lake. To one side of the beach, Steve saw a small rowboat lying with its hull to the sun. Steve never tired of a beautiful sight, and he took plenty of time relishing this one. The lake was a mirror today, and the mountains on the other side seemed to reach into infinity, their height doubled by the lake reflection. He wished he had had a camera, and yet a camera couldn't do it justice. The deep green of the trees against the blue of that water. The trees! Steve blinked and looked again. He was still a little sleepy and he had been up all night. It was probably a third of a mile across the lake, so distance could have been a factor. He may have imagined it. He stood very still and kept watching. Now the trees along the distant lake shore were clear and distinct, and every trunk, every vertical line, solid. Nothing unusual. So maybe it was a flashback of sorts. Maybe it was wishful thinking. Maybe he hadn't seen the same weird mirage he had seen from O-Town. But his instinct was nagging him again, the same as before. Danger, it said. Pay attention. He looked away to clear his eyes and hopefully his mind. He was too tired to trust his senses. Then he saw Tracy, and all thoughts of the mirage disappeared. If his instinct was still speaking, he was no longer listening. She was swimming in the lake, just now coming out from behind a fallen sun-bleached snag that dipped into the water. Around her, the water sparkled like diamonds in the sun, and as her strong arms propelled her along, the morning light made her fair skin shimmer. Maybe I shouldn't be watching, he thought. But she hadn't seen him yet, and like everything else around here, she was a breathtaking sight. He quickly scanned the shore and spotted her clothes hung on the dead branches of the fallen snag. Was he dreaming? Was she a mirage? No, he was awake, and she was there all right, with a considerable stretch of open space between herself and her clothing. For an instant he thought she looked his way, that their eyes met as she paused to push back the red hair from her face, but her behavior didn't indicate she was aware of his presence, especially as she swam to the shore, climbed up on the rocks, and crossed the open space to where her clothes were hanging. In the fleeting moment it took for Tracy to gather her clothing and disappear into the trees, Steve's curiosity was fully satisfied. He was pleased to find that his initial guess had been less than correct. He had figured she would be nearly perfect. Now he knew she was quite perfect. Okay, so tomorrow we will get into chapter 11. Now, as it happens, Steve's kind of getting himself into some pretty bad trouble here. He has discovered that there's more than just a bear, and that he's getting into some very deep stuff, starting to like Tracy and trying to figure out what killed his brother at the same time. It's a bad combination there in Hyde River. Anyway, I hope that you're joining me for chapter 11 tomorrow. And I am so glad that you are watching, and I hope that you're enjoying this novel. As I have said before, I have got more books from Frank Peretti. I've got some books from Ted Decker, and I've got one book from Terry Blackstock. And so when we get finished with this book, you all could tell me if you would like to have a reading of another novel and from which author, and we will get into that. I'm kind of thinking, though, that maybe, just maybe, I'll either read The Bride Collector to you, or maybe I'll get into the series of The Circle with you. But I would like to give you all a chance to choose first before I make the decision, so we'll just figure that out. Anyway, as I said, I hope that you are enjoying this book, and I will be with you tomorrow for the reading of chapter 11. And just stay tuned because it just keeps getting more and more exciting. I hope that you all have a very great and blessed day.